Hello, I'm Jan Pottker, the author of 9 books. My latest is the first biography of Vivien Thomas, written for adults. Some of you may have heard of Mr. Thomas's blue baby surgery, but he had many other medical achievements that were equally trailblazing and for which he really is not known. First, let's talk about Vivien Thomas's successful research to find a cure for traumatic shock. We began in January 1931 when Dr. Alfred Blalock had just hired Vivien Thomas as a surgical lab researcher at Vanderbilt. At Vanderbilt in 1931, Dr. Blalock was very ambitious, and he hoped to find a cure for traumatic shock, which had killed millions of people over time. He had an idea about how to resolve traumatic shock, but Dr. Blalock needed a surgical lab tech to do the actual work, the surgical research experiment that would prove or disprove his ideas. He hired Vivien Thomas because he said that this man would accomplish the many hundreds of surgical research experiments that would help him reach his goal. Mr. Thomas began his first surgical experiments on shock the very same week that he started work at Vanderbilt University, and he was soon operating without Dr. Blalock's oversight. Now, traumatic shock, what is it? It can occur after an injury or even allergic reaction. It means the person does not die from the injury, but rather the traumatic shock that follows in reaction to an injury. Blalock thought that the old methods of treating traumatic shock were all wrong, and he was right. There had been over the time, some truly strange cures. People were told to drink copious amounts of coffee or even drink ammonia. The weirdest cure was, well, have you ever heard of the expression, "Are you going to smoke up my rear end?" Well, that was once thought to be a cure for traumatic shock, and people had to endure that. By the end of World War I in 1918, most doctors were convinced that traumatic shock came from some type of poison in the body, and you could use charcoal or something to cure it. But that idea wasn't right either. What happens is if you're wounded, vital fluids from the blood circulation are sent to the injured part to try and heal it. But the removal of these vital fluids from a person's blood circulation meant the person was missing essential red blood cells in plasma. That's what caused traumatic shock to set in, and usually death, unfortunately, would follow. What Mr. Thomas did was to injure lab dogs under anesthesia by applying pressure to them or even burning them. Then he measured the exact quantity of fluid in the wounded area. Eventually, he and Dr. Blalock realized that if either plasma or whole blood were infused into the dog, it came out of traumatic shock and didn't die. Mr. Thomas conducted hundreds and hundreds of experiments in traumatic shock to solve this medical mystery. Thomas's work on shock was so important that when World War II began in 1941, the government gave Thomas a draft exemption so he could keep working on his shock experiments. In fact, after the war ended, the government awarded Vivien Thomas a certificate of appreciation. By now, Blalock and Thomas had left Vanderbilt and were working in surgery at Johns Hopkins University. Then at the end of the war in Europe, General Patton announced that the main reason the Allies had won the war with relatively few medical deaths was the treatment of giving Allied wounded fighters plasma and blood. So I think the war heroes were not just the generals like MacArthur, Eisenhower, Patton, but also Dr. Blalock and Vivien Thomas. During World War II, Vivien Thomas, the man with a high school diploma, was given another surprising responsibility. So many doctors had been drafted that Thomas, a high school graduate, was given the authority to teach surgical techniques to medical students. These young doctors went on to become the best surgeons in the U.S. An amazing number became head of surgery departments or head of professional organizations. During the war in 1943 and 1944, Thomas also created his best-known blue baby surgery. Prior to that, doctors believed two things. You should never operate on the heart or even near the heart. Cardiac surgery was off limits. Also, physicians would not operate on a sick baby, even if it was dying. In fact, the head of anesthesia refused to take part in anything to do with the blue baby surgery, saying it was tantamount to murder. Both operating on the heart and operating on a baby just weren't done. But Vivien Thomas changed all that. Thomas and Blalock's work on blue babies was due to requests made by Dr. Helen Taussig, a brilliant pediatric cardiologist, who met with them because some of her babies were dying. They had been born with a congenital heart problem known as Tetralogy of Fallot. They had 4 defects in their hearts. In other words, they were born with malformed hearts because they had blood vessels that were wrongly attached between the heart and lungs. As a result, blue babies had a severe shortage of oxygen in their circulation. Their skin even looked blue. If they were lucky enough to live to be toddlers, they still couldn't run or play. There was no way for them to lead normal lives at this point. Nearly all died before adulthood. Taussig brilliantly told the men how to tackle the heart defects. She said, switch the plumbing around. Of course, Dr. Blalock turned to Mr. Thomas to find a way to help these babies. Vivien Thomas had to find out the whole thing for himself because Dr. Blalock was busy traveling for the government, teaching the military doctors how to treat traumatic shock. To solve the problems experienced by blue babies who had TOF, Mr. Thomas had to replicate the baby's problems on his lab dogs before he could find a solution. He needed to create a dramatic lack of oxygen in the lab dogs, which took him more than a year to do. In the course of work, he invented a machine that helped these tiny babies breathe during surgery. He worked 14-hour days, came only home to sleep, eat, and shower. And finally, through trial and error, he figured out a way to greatly reduce the amount of oxygen in his lab dogs. But now he had to actually solve the problem by figuring out how to increase the dog's amount of oxygenated blood. Mr. Thomas followed Dr. Taussig's advice to switch the plumbing around. He used a small vein to join the heart and lung to lessen the amount of unwanted oxygen that flowed into their lungs, rather than circulating throughout their bodies. Next, he enlarged or opened a hole in the infinitesimally small heart that provided a shunt so that enough oxygen could get into the dog's or baby's blood circulation. He knew that surgery on these tiny, tiny babies who were not growing normally would require special tools not available at the time. So he whittled down needles so the tip would be so much smaller. He took apart the thread used for stitching or suturing the babies so it would not be so thick, because blue babies were so severely undersized. By the end of 1944, Mr. Thomas was exhausted, as was his wife Clara, who had to take care of their $2 all by herself. But he had figured out a way to operate on blue babies that meant they would have sufficient oxygen in their blood. What he made was not a permanent cure for blue babies, but rather a palliative way to help them live normal lives. What he created is still the basis for blue baby surgery today. Now you're looking at Vivien Thomas's favorite lab dog, Anna. Besides her good looks and nice temperament, she was the first to survive both his experimental work on the heart, first decreasing the oxygen and then figuring out how to bring it back. In late 1944, Vivien Thomas had the answer. Helen Taussig's TOF patient, Eileen Saxon, was dying. Taussig convinced Blalock to operate on this pathetically underweight child. She was more than a year. She should have weighed more than 20 pounds, but she weighed only 9 pounds. Dr. Blalock was a risk taker. Though he had never performed the surgery before, he'd only watched Mr. Thomas demonstrate the surgery to him once on a lab dog. Before Dr. Blalock started surgery, he called Thomas from his lab and told him to get over to the operating room right away. He knew that Thomas would have to instruct him through the surgery and would ask Thomas questions like, "Is this incision long enough?" And Thomas would say, "Yes, it's long enough, if not too long." Making this even more unusual was that Johns Hopkins was a segregated hospital and university, and it had absolutely no Black surgeons or healthcare providers on its staff. So the white chief of surgery, Alfred Blalock, needed his Black lab tech, a man again with a high school education, to be at his side in the operating room to guide him through at least 100 operations. Eileen Saxon survived her surgery, and after completing 2 more successful surgeries on blue babies with Thomas at his side, Dr. Blalock published an article in 1945 that blew the medical world away. This was the beginning of heart surgery. It was a worldwide news story. No credit was given to Vivien Thomas, nor was he identified in this 1947 photo. In 1946, Dr. Blalock called on Vivien Thomas to develop yet another surgery on babies with a different congenital heart problem called transposition of the great arteries. These babies had a shorter lifespan than even the blue babies. They didn't live usually beyond 6 months. Blalock was so busy performing and demonstrating the blue baby surgeries because Hopkins was inundated with parents seeking cures for their child that he left Thomas completely alone on how to help this new group of babies who were born with misplaced aorta and pulmonary arteries. They, like the blue babies, were also starved for oxygen, but their problems were different. When Vivien Thomas set to work, he tested one thing and another, but they didn't work out. He wasn't and couldn't move the great arteries to a new location as he'd done with the blue babies, but he found a palliative fix for these babies' hearts. He noticed that the atrial septum adjoining the upper right border of the heart was thin. After a few years of lab work, Mr. Thomas decided to widen the heart by removing a small amount of the heart's tissue, which allowed for a better mix of oxygenated blood to flow into the baby's blood circulation. Although Mr. Thomas was a modest man, he was so incredibly proud of having created a fix that he was giddy with delight, for he composed the entire surgery by himself. When he informed Dr. Blalock of his success, the chief of surgery came to the lab to look at the dogs himself. Dr. Blalock looked at them, but he couldn't even see Mr. Thomas's sutures, for Thomas was an elegant surgeon. Instead, Dr. Blalock closed his eyes and felt the heart, trying to feel the sutures. He was so impressed that he said to Mr. Thomas, "This looks like something the Lord made." His comment was about the opening Thomas made for the babies born with transposition of the great arteries, and not about the blue baby surgery. Blalock turned to Thomas's notes, and he wrote at the top, "This is a surgery created solely by Vivien Thomas." I'll tell you more about this later in more detail when we talk about race discrimination. But you can imagine the anger Mr. Thomas felt when Blalock published the result of the surgery in such a way that the medical world thought it was created by Alfred Blalock and one of his young surgical fellows, C. Rollins Hanlon, and it is still called the Blalock-Hanlon surgery. In the 1950s, Thomas worked on more ways to save people from heart problems, particularly cardiac arrest or heart attacks. As a team member, Vivien Thomas helped develop cardiac pulmonary resuscitation, or CPR, which can save people during heart attacks. He also worked on the portable external defibrillator. In fact, he and Dr. Jerome Kay were the first to use CPR with a defibrillator to restart a heart. Then shortly before his retirement in 1979, Mr. Thomas assisted the very first Black surgery resident at Johns Hopkins U, whose name was Levi Watkins, in a successful attempt to implant an automated defibrillator in a human being's heart. This work continues to save thousands of people in the U.S. alone. Let's quickly summarize. Vivien Thomas's work on shock helped the Allies win World War II. His 2 surgical works with babies born with congenital heart defects kick-started the world of cardiac surgery, and his work on CPR and the electric defibrillator saved people from death by heart attacks. Let's put Mr. Thomas's contribution to congenital heart disease in perspective. In the 1940s, only 10% of babies born with congenital heart problems survived childhood. But Vivien Thomas's original blue baby surgery induced doctors throughout the world to try out surgeries on babies with different heart diseases. Now more than 90% of newborns with heart issues survive, like Jimmy Kimmel's son. Pretty impressive for a Black man from Nashville with a high school diploma who worked at 2 segregated universities. Would you like to learn more? In my other videos, I describe how his background influenced him, the different ways in which Vanderbilt University and Johns Hopkins mistreated and discriminated against him, and how his accomplishments are finally being honored after his death. You may also want to read the only biography for adults about Vivien Thomas, available through Barnes & Noble's independent bookstores, Amazon, and Kindle. Or you can take a look at the book's website, which is simply VivienThomasBook.com. Thank you.